The value of close air support for ground forces in a battle area cannot be overemphasized, and the accuracy and formidable firepower of the tactical air units within all services cannot be denied. In addition to close air support, one of the many other tasks of combat air support is detection of enemy activities beyond the forward edge of the battle area. It is essential that these enemy activities are searched out and destroyed before their effectiveness can be applied. These are difficult targets to acquire. The difficulty of target acquisition was fully recognized by the Department of Defense. The Director, Defense Research and Engineering, keynoted the requirements when he wrote, "The effectiveness of our current and proposed air-to-ground weapons is limited by our ability to acquire enemy targets on the ground in preparation for attack by either fixed-wing or rotary-wing aircraft." Consequently, the Director, DDR&E, tasked the Weapons System Evaluation Group in Arlington, Virginia, to investigate the feasibility of evaluating the current operational capability to acquire such targets beyond the immediate battle area. To accomplish the task, WESEG and the Institute for Defense Analysis first envisioned an evaluation program based on field testing of the current and newly developed target acquisition systems. However, they concluded that data secured by previous field test methods were not sufficient to accurately predict the relative importance of the various acquisition systems and techniques, especially under the many environmental conditions prevalent. Further, because of apparent complexities of target acquisition factors, realistic field testing would necessarily be extensive and thus generally uneconomical due to the large number of sorties required. As a result, WESEG suggested a program whereby target acquisition factors could be researched through the use of simulators. The data obtained by simulation could then be validated by limited field tests. Also, the simulation method could be useful in the evaluation of the various systems in the inventory, as well as alternative systems and techniques at all levels of development. As a result, a simulator program was projected. The Seekval Joint Test Program was especially designed to examine the acquisition of varied targets in a simulated environment, closely representative of Central Europe, where armored conflicts could most likely occur. The Air Force was designated by DDR&E as executive agent to implement the program, with active participation by the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. The Joint Test Force was formed consisting of an Air Force Test Director and 4 Deputy Directors, one from each of the services. The Joint Test Force implemented a sequential test program consisting of terrain table experiments, target imagery experiments, an instrumentation test, and a limited field test of direct visual and aided visual target acquisition. The initial implementation of the program began in August 1973 with terrain table experiments conducted at the Aerospace Medical Research Laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio, with available simulation facilities. The results of the initial experiments provided guidance for WESEG design of further aided and unaided experiments. As a follow-on to these initial tests, several contractual options were considered. Ultimately, Martin Marietta was selected to conduct additional terrain table experiments with an integrated and expanded terrain simulation facility. To ensure maximum benefits from the experiments, the devices tested, scenarios adopted, and procedures were kept as close as possible to operational reality. The simulated cockpit, or habitat, was held stationary while the table was designed to move under the observers to simulate overflight. A TV sensor with 3 fields of view, narrow, wide, and variable, was positioned in the simulated cockpit to serve as an acquisition aid. The TV system was pointed by the position of the helmet-mounted sight and provided data on method of search. The terrain table experiment was composed of 5 experiments, 3 using fixed-wing aircraft and 2 using rotary-wing aircraft. A total of 584 observers were used during the experiments. 292 were untrained Martin Marietta personnel, and 292 were trained military air observers selected from all of the services. As in the first terrain table tests, the observers were carefully screened. Information was collected on their habits, health, vision, flight background, and previous target acquisition experience. All observer participants were thoroughly indoctrinated on test procedures and furnished with briefing materials such as photographs, maps, and charts. The acquisition measure for fixed wing was range, and for rotary wing, it was time. The observers were briefed on the timing method used during each mission, whereby a dowser was raised at a given point during each target run and immediately dropped when the observer signaled target acquisition. The time allotted was a 1-minute interval for rotary wing and target overfly for fixed wing. The 5 experiments covered 9 experimental factors that were varied throughout the tests. Method of search, clutter, contrast, illumination angle, number of targets, pop-up range, pop-up altitude, coloration, and observer training. The search methods for fixed wing were direct view alone and direct view supplemented by wide view, narrow view, and variable view TV displays. In the rotary wing experiments, the search method was direct view alone, direct view with stabilized optics, or TV. The 2 different contrast levels were created by varying the reflectivity of both targets and backgrounds. The tank targets used dark olive drab and beige colors and were darker than the target background. 3 levels of clutter were obtained by adjusting locations of the trees and bushes on the terrain table. Normally, 3 tanks were used in each target. One experiment varied the tank targets from 0, 1, 3, and 9. Data during these 5 experiments were gathered by debriefing each observer after each mission, by the observations of the umpire, and the monitors for each run. All data were entered into a computer after a quick look action verified that the accumulated data were valid. As might be expected, effects of clutter were pronounced throughout the experiment. The method of producing clutter on the model is feasible. However, properly quantifying clutter remains unsolved. Although the terrain table experiments were exploratory, they produced some predictable results, as well as questions requiring further study. The dynamic real-time phase of the Seekval program used the Boeing multi-mission simulator. It included a simulated cockpit, a special system for simulating electro-optical sensors and wide-angle imagery, which could be projected on a large curved screen to simulate real-time target acquisition. The imagery used for the direct visual experiments was available film coverage from field tests conducted by Joint Task Force 2 several years ago. Review of the film confirmed that for simulation, improved imagery was mandatory. The improved rotary wing imagery collected at Fort Lewis was used for the follow-on multi-mission simulator experiments. The only aid used in the rotary wing visual evaluation was a generic electro-optical sensor slaved to a monocular sight mounted on a pantograph. The observer in the cockpit aimed the sight at the target projected on the screen. The TV in the cockpit displayed the same target scene viewed within the sight. The view on the TV display was activated and directed by signals from the pantograph. The electro-optical device was used only after the target was visually acquired, and was mainly for the observer to verify that his target acquisition was correct. 22 Army and 10 Marine Corps aviators with recently acquired low-altitude experience and standard aviator physical qualification were used in the experiments. The total number of test conditions was 112. 38 sequences were used with or without aid, and variations of cues, such as fact controllers or photo briefing. The test simulated target acquisition from a hovering position of a pop-up profile at ranges of 400, 800, and 1,200 meters from the target. A projector dowser was used to establish the beginning of the time available to the observer for target acquisition. The time required by the observer to acquire the target and activate the event button was used as the measure of performance. It was obvious that the simulation was limited by the projected film resolution. The recognized advantages of this type simulator are the realistic integration with devices corresponding to target acquisition devices. Also, the realistic inclusion of atmospheric contrast attenuation and a wraparound effect, which increases the realism of the simulator. As with the terrain table experiments, the validation of the measurements made in the multi-mission simulator must be based on results from the field tests conducted under the same conditions. In order to validate the simulation data collected and to achieve reliable comparisons of these data with real-world conditions, the field test was necessarily structured to gather data on the critical areas such as aircraft course, speed, range, altitude, time, target to background contrast, and clutter. Such controlled conditions were mandatory to assure accuracy of the flight test data. As a result, several tests were accomplished to assure that adequate instrumentation and procedures were available to obtain the data and the control required for target acquisition variables. Photographic data reduction methods were developed by the Air Force Avionics Laboratory to enable field test contrast values to be produced in a timely manner. Because contrast was shown to be dependent upon target orientation and illumination conditions, the most accurate measurements obviously occur at the time and location of acquisition by each test observer. For the field test, the RMS-2 with the Army ground controllers provided the vectoring capability and recorded flight information and other data relayed from the test aircraft. In the interest of preventing loss of data during the tests, backup audio and video instrumentation provided an airborne history of test events. For the field test operations, the Air Force Weather Service provided data on weather and atmospheric conditions which could influence target contrast seen from an aircraft. The U.S. Army and Washington State National Guard supplied medium tanks, armored personnel carriers, and trucks to provide a variety of contrast and scene clutter. An additional target was located separately, consisting of resolution bars and a Landolt ring. The gap in the ring was movable to serve as an acquisition test for observers. The 3-bar resolution target was used for check and calibration of electro-optical sensors. The test subjects were all military personnel, equally divided between trained and untrained observers assigned by the services. As in the other experiments, each observer was given various examinations covering habits, experience, visual acuity, and color blindness for comparative data. The field test consisted of 5 experiments, 3 using fixed-wing aircraft and 2 using rotary-wing aircraft. Test factors corresponded as closely as possible to those used in the 2 simulation experiments. That is, both direct visual and aided visual acquisitions were accomplished during varied conditions of clutter, contrast, illumination, aircraft speed, pre-mission briefing level, target offsets, and range. The aircraft used for the tests included a T-39 containing a standard package consisting of a helmet-mounted video system, a video and audio recorder, an event switch, an RMS-2 transceiver, an IRIG time code generator, and an interface unit between aircraft instrumentation to the RMS-2. The T-39 aircraft was used for high-speed, direct visual portions of the fixed-wing experiments. An O-2 was also equipped with the standard package and was used for low-speed, direct visual experiments. A Cessna with a generic electro-optical sensor was used during the aided portions of the fixed-wing experiments. A helicopter equipped with the standard instrumentation package was used for direct visual experiments. A similar helicopter containing the I-STAR system was used for aided acquisition. I-STAR is a helicopter-mounted research and development adaptation of the Tizio electro-optical system. During each mission day, a helicopter obtained black and white, color, and infrared sensitive film coverage of each target site from several ranges. These missions were scheduled at 0900, 1300, and 1600 hours to provide the Air Force Avionics Laboratory with the photographic data from which target-to-background contrast was determined for each acquisition event. Ground-based photometric measurements were made to characterize the grayscale luminance and optical transmission properties of the atmosphere. For the fixed-wing experiments, both direct visual and aided visual acquisitions were factors addressed for each scene. Other factors were number of targets, high-speed and low-speed visual acquisition, and level of target briefing. A shift in flight path was used to provide a new level of target offset. Morning or late afternoon flights provided a change in scene shadows or illumination from those of the midday shadowless conditions. The rotary wing experiments were conducted at 1,000 feet altitude to assure that the targets were unmasked for the longer ranges.
Flight number 6, visor up. Okay.
1, 2.6, and 4.2 kilometers were the rotary wing acquisition ranges. The I-STAR acquisition system was used to enable the observer to locate and confirm target acquisition after his initial visual acquisition.
Okay, what you got? 3 tanks, tan in color, and a straight up formation.
Target offset conditions were varied by changing the aircraft heading as it hovered for the acquisition trial. At least 500 individuals participated in the field tests, requiring nearly 850 hours of flying time. Of the 1,800 attempted target acquisitions, data loss was minimal because the instrumentation provided a dual purpose and backup capability. Analysis of the factors provided expected results. Method of search, illumination, number of targets in an array, type of briefing were the significant fixed-wing acquisition factors. Clutter, range, method of search, and training affected rotary wing acquisition more than other factors, such as target offset. The field tests provided a vast quantity of carefully documented data, available for further study and for applications to future programs. A comparative analysis of the field test and simulator results was conducted by the Seekval Joint Test Force. Many treatments from each test were not included in the comparison because of dissimilarities in test procedure or factors. Search method was clearly the most important experimental factor. The terrain table results correctly predicted the relationship between field test direct visual and aided target acquisition. Terrain table acquisition was extended to 11 kilometers instead of the 6 kilometers experienced in the field test, a finding attributed to real-world atmospheric loss. The multi-mission simulator predicted the relationship between aided and unaided rotary wing acquisition when physical differences in acquisition systems are taken into account. However, it is clear that improved projected image quality is needed at longer acquisition ranges. Seekval test experience emphasizes the importance of carefully controlling and maintaining consistent experimental factors and procedures. Quick-look data control and analysis is needed to identify data collection and other procedural weaknesses. Factors which are difficult to define and quantify must be given special study and attention to assure consistency required for test comparisons and analysis. Scene clutter and contrast were the most difficult factors to quantify throughout the Seekval tests. The concept of studying target acquisition aid sensors employing simulators proved valid, and thus field testing exclusively is unnecessary. The comparative analysis indicated simulators were predictors of relative results for different methods of search. An independent analysis was accomplished by the Institute of Defense Analysis and the Weapons System Evaluation Group. Meanwhile, the data available from the Seekval Joint Test Force program will provide the foundation for developing simulators into reliable and valuable tools for evaluating equipment and techniques used in the capability to acquire targets in a combat air support role.